everyone. I want to say thank you for attending today's discussion on education as a tool for advancing peace and prosperity. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan Elliott. I'm the president and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and we're really delighted to have participants from our Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Program here with us today to discuss their policy ideas related to education. The National Committee on American Foreign Policy started this program in 2023, and we're just about this fall to begin the third year and the third cohort of participants. And we really are very pleased to have participants from, from our previous cohorts to talk to you about their experiences, their policy ideas, and, the kinds of things they did working together in the program. So we have 4 former participants today. We have Matthew O'Neill, Patricia O'Lynn, Matthew Taylor, and then we will have Anne Devlin, who is just joining us a little bit late. But we also have Emma DeSouza, the director of the Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Program, who will moderate today's discussion. So before I turn the program over to Emma, I just want to review that, the participants will have a discussion guided by Emma. And then when they get to a certain point, they will have a Q&A session with audience participants. So if you would like to have a question, look down at the bottom of your screen. You'll see there's a Q&A box. You click on that, type in your question, and go ahead and start typing them in right away as soon as you get them, because the participants will be able to, and Emma will be able to see the questions. And as they get them, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. So anyway, thank you again for supporting our program. Thank you again for being here today. And I'm going to turn the program over now to Emma DeSouza, the director of our Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Program.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's lovely to have you all here. Good afternoon, good evening to those joining us on the island of Ireland. I'm delighted to have with us today 4 participants from the Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Programme, 2 from our first year and 2 from the second. And this topic that we're discussing today is education, which has been a core research area for participants across the Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Programme. So what I'd like to do is have a conversation today about the role of education and how it can advance the sustainability of Northern Ireland's peace process. To get us started, I actually want to bring in each of the participants for the programme and ask them to share a little bit about what the current challenges are in relation to education and solutions and how we can overcome them. So perhaps I'd ask you to speak briefly for a minute or two on your research topic and the solutions or recommendations you came up with. So if I could start, please, with Patricia.
Thanks so much, Emma, and it's lovely to be invited to participate in this evening's event. So thank you so much for having me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Patricia O'Lynn. I'm the head of policy and engagement at the Law Society for Northern Ireland. I'm a professional educationalist by background. Spent a little bit of time in politics, but my passion is always centered around the educational sphere. My topic of interest derived from my doctoral research is school exclusion. So I produced a policy paper called Non-Excluding Schools, and the key is in the title. My policy aspiration is to create an educational landscape in Northern Ireland where schools no longer exclude, formally through expulsion or suspension, or informally through exclusionary in classroom practices, isolation within the school environment, reduced timetables. The list goes on and on. Some of the key recommendations I made in my policy paper related to making visible invisible mechanisms of exclusion that begin in the classroom, revisiting the legislative standing of school exclusion in Northern Ireland to try and change legislation that enables this to take place, or at least to change it to prevent it, placing a statutory duty on schools to put young people in another educational environment within 12 days of them dropping out of the system. And then last but not least, opening a community debate on the continued validity of school exclusion as a practice. So I'll not say too much else. I'll wait until we get into the discussion, and I'm keen to hear what everybody else has to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And Matthew Taylor.
Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Taylor. My topic was quite similar to Patricia's. Mine was on SEN, children and young people within education more broadly. So I was looking at some of the challenges with that. So some of the challenges were lack of the Northern Ireland Executive being able to increase the funds that it has without revenue raising powers, the lack of a comprehensive service pathway for those who are diagnosed with a SEN condition to access healthcare or education services in the local area, or know which services are available in their area. Very poor capacity building for SEN services, and a lack of a joined up approach between healthcare trusts, and underdeveloped training services within education for teachers and other school staff. And finally, very sparse strategic support within the executive for SEN more broadly. So some of the recommendations that I had for this issue were, firstly, to develop an SEN strategy. We don't have an SEN strategy in Northern Ireland. Most of our approach to SEN policy comes within wider educational policy, with SEN being a subsection within that, rather than a standalone strategy, which I think it should have, because their needs are different to neurotypical students. We have a lack of legislative parity between the UK and Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, in the rest of the UK, you have educational health and care plans for students over the age of 19, whereas in Northern Ireland that doesn't apply. So in Northern Ireland, we have a really amazing campaigner, a campaign called Caleb's Cause, which is highlighting the need for post-19 SEN services. So I was working with Caleb's family in creating this policy paper and using their recommendations as part of my own recommendations as well. Thirdly was to prioritise access to early intervention, particularly within educational psychology, which is seen as really the gatekeeper to being given a statement and to be given a formal diagnosis, and to, if need be, adapt and edit the statementing process to make it easier for those who need it. And finally, to develop a code of inclusive practice within school, so that there's mandatory SEN and disability training for all teaching staff, just to aid the aid discussion of SEN and allow for SEN students to feel more welcome within their school environment.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And just to remind participants and those taking part in today's webinar that you can add questions into the Q&A box. And if you have questions here around SEN and school exclusion for Matthew and Patricia, then please do insert them into the Q&A. Next, I'd like to welcome Anne and ask Anne if you'd like to share a little bit about what your policy paper covered and some of the solutions that you were working on.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. Sorry I was a little bit late. I'll have to try and blame the time difference, I think. So yeah, my name's Anne Devlin. I'm an economist at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin. I work on a range of issues, one of which is education. In 2022, and I suppose this leads into just how I was interested in this area and what I looked at in my policy paper. We did a report within the Institute for the Department of Taoiseach Shared Island Unit, which looked at education across the island of Ireland. And despite that being such an important area and a small island with such close links, it actually was the first time work had really been done, So some really, it turned out to be a huge report. Some really interesting stuff come out for me in particular. And I suppose it was even interesting working in the South on this report, but having come through the Northern Irish education system. So much higher levels of early school leaving in the North, a lot of which ties into sort of socioeconomic background and things like that, which isn't new. We've had report after report that looks at this. And also lower levels of social mobility in Northern Ireland in terms of, young people maybe getting higher levels of education than their parents, which is something we see a lot of in the South. And, in Ireland now, nearly everybody is going on to post-18 education, whether that's HE or FE. So that study took a mixed methods approach. And when we spoke to people on the ground working in education, what come through time and time again was the role that academic selection was playing in this. So streaming children really at 10 or 11 into different types of schools on this sort of perceived ability, because really who's able to tell at that stage? So just huge ramifications coming out of this. My policy paper sort of talked about different things, them socioeconomic, everybody being funneled in, the special educational needs that Matthew's talking about, all being funneled into particular schools, the funding challenges that schools are facing across the board, and then some schools really having to deal with just a lot of disadvantage and really not the capacity to do so. To be honest, there's a lack of robust research on the direct implications of academic selection. We sort of know what's going on, but it's a bit anecdotal. There is a big data set coming out next year, so I hope to continue this work. In terms of my policy recommendations, really they were quite simple. Matthew and Patricia have shown me up there with their range of nuanced recommendations, but mine just was to bin academic selection. But in the meantime, I suppose continuing the debate, sort of getting that robust research to really prove, there's a lot of talk from different sides. It's been really drawn along party lines at this stage, in terms of who supports and who opposes academic selection. So I think really increasing the evidence base and getting the discussion going and thinking about the well-being of children and young people and the ramifications for them is crucial to that. But looking forward to the discussion, everybody. Thank you.
That's a really important point, and thank you very much. And last but not least, Matthew O'Neill.
I changed my name to Matt just to make things easier in case anything happens with the two Matthews in that sense. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to the National Committee, the kind members that have joined today during the discussion, Emma and Shana, for having me today. And I also just want to say it's a particular privilege for me to share this panel with Dr. Devlin, Dr. O'Lynn and Mr. Taylor. These are people whose careers I have followed very closely over the years around this discussion, and they very much are leading a lot of the on-the-ground change we're trying to see here in Northern Ireland. So it's very humbling for me to be in their presence and even talking about this. My paper looked at integrated education, and the reason is I'm not an educationist by background. It was my own lived experience that propelled me to investigate that. My own training is as a political economist for my sins. And mine was maybe more of a philosophical discussion and state of play as to where we are with what integrated education means in Northern Ireland. If I could start with a starting point, I always think about how it is not the child who creates the world, but it is the world that creates the child. And what kind of world are we handing down when we dare to say that fear matters more than truth and custom matters more than justice for them? This is, in my mind, this is not merely a discussion of the mere mechanics of educational policy, but it is how do we actually reckon with the soul of a society and a community itself that continues to have divided its children by the cross on the school gates which they attend. In Northern Ireland, we are watching the state, in all its political convenience, tell its people that segregation is far easier than the courage it is to move on. We see the demand from parents, from young people themselves, for what schools where Catholic Protestants, as well as other faiths and children of none, would like to learn side by side. In doing so, learn the differences, not by the mean of division, but by actually understanding each other. And yet those voices are met not with open doors, but really with closed political ranks. I'd like to make the argument that this is not the failure of policy in what Patricia or Matthew or Anne have outlined. It is a betrayal of principle itself within our society. And I tell you this, when the executive claims the authority to deny integrated schools, there are too few Catholics or too few Protestants. It is defending a community. It is not defending a community. It is defending control. It is defending the right to define identity by fear rather than any form of aspiration. It is using bureaucracy to strangle the imagination of a new generation trying to come through our peace process. But let us not think this struggle is only based on identity and religion alone. No, what we witness here is part of a much deeper crisis, a crisis that reaches into the marrow of democracies across the world, a war against intellectualism, against curiosity, against the idea that truth can be shared and grown within a common space. And anti-intellectualism is not born in parliaments. It is sown in classrooms we refuse to build. In minds we leave isolated. In the truths we do not dare teach. And then a child learns that their school is not for them, that their presence is not a statistical inconvenience. We are not educating them. We are indoctrinating them into smallness. So I ask you, what kind of society are we choosing to be? One that teaches its young to think, or one that teaches them to obey? Because integrated education is not merely about bringing children together. It is about challenging every adult who profits politically, economically, ideologically from keeping children apart. One of the quotes that I always think about when it comes to this, I look to James Baldwin, and I'm finishing very soon, Emma, and we can get to this conversation. The purpose of education is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for him herself, to make his or her decisions. If we deny that right, if we silence that presence, we are not educating, we are entrenching. So my recommendations was about trying to adopt an integrated ethos for all schools, in trying to look at how you can teach the conflict and use it as a standard in all schools in that divide, to understand differences and to make it clear to have a standardized ethos instead of different ones prevailing. One that can include all faiths or none was one of my main arguments. So let us then break this pattern. Let us teach our children not who they are supposed to be, but what they might become together. I want to say thank you again for your time and for allowing me to offer this brief snapshot into the ongoing work that I'm doing with Integrated Alumni. So I'll finish my comments there, Emma, because I know I could go on longer.
Thank you very much, Matt. I think you might have just got your single transferable speech there. I think that's the one. That's it. Just repeat it, because I'm sold. I'm totally sold. All right. So I think what I'd like to do is kind of touch on something that you talked about there, Matt, and open it up to the wider floor. So it seems that one of the greatest challenges there is a reluctance politically to advance some of the issues around education in Northern Ireland. So what can be done to try and overcome political intransience or political indifference to addressing the issues around education? And is there anything that can be done on a transatlantic basis to try and encourage some kind of movement with this bloc? And open up to the rest of the floor as well if anyone else wants to come in.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in there just briefly, because I think it's very applicable to the conversation on academic selection. You know, the lines have been drawn some time ago and we seem to be sticking there. And every so often it just rears its head again, or it becomes a bit of a talking point. I laughed with Matt a while ago. I appeared before the Education Committee to talk about educational disadvantage. And I was all prepped, did my homework, sat down. First question, academic selection. So it's back in, there's a lot of chat and two entirely different views. And to be honest, I'm not sure we're going to see much movement, in my opinion. To me, that's where the research comes in and getting out there with the facts and figures about how this is harming, at times, the community or the political parties' communities that are keeping this in place, and really, you know, getting the lead from the ground rather than from the ground up, which can often be the case in Northern Ireland and sort of difficult issues.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew, you have some experience in that kind of ground up grassroots campaigning. Do you think that that's an avenue to apply political pressure?
Well, I think we've seen this with the recent announcement about votes of 16, not to change the topic, but I think that does apply, because if you look at the way that young people respond to the Good Friday Agreement, to the peace process in Northern Ireland, and the background to that, young people now don't remember the agreement. They weren't there for it. I wasn't born when the agreement was signed. Young people don't see the agreement. They see the current failures. They see the here and now. Peace isn't something that you inherit. It's something that you have to teach. And to echo Matt's point around integrated education, is if you don't allow for young people to meet each other from different backgrounds, to experience and make mistakes together, you're not going to have that foundation when they get to politics or to a career or to the ballot box. So I think it's important the grassroots change. It doesn't have to be an organization. It doesn't have to be a slogan, but it definitely has to be some sort of foundation, whether that's in schools, whether that's in a shared space. I think that's really important, is that allow young people to make mistakes, allow young people to offend each other, allow young people to do all of these things, but it's better if they do it younger than if they do it as adults. And pieces, we in Northern Ireland often just keep saying, well, we'll never go back to the way it was before, we'll never go back. But there's nothing stopping us from going back. And the only way we can prevent that is to make peace something you teach, make peace part of your social fabric. And that's not something I think we've done. I think by segregating education by gender, by faith, and by if you have disability or not, makes our society so much less welcoming and inclusive. And it means that whenever you see a person in a wheelchair walking or going down the street, you'll stare at them in a way that you wouldn't if you grew up having that be part of your natural life. And that's such a simple example, but that shows how putting everyone together and working and everyone understanding each other's complexities makes things so much easier in terms of a shared space. And the only way you can do that is through education.
You make a good point. And also on the point around segregation, there's also a piece of work that was done by an NGO called Parallel Histories in the UK, which showed that there's actually a disparity between which periods of history are being taught in Northern Irish schools, where state schools are teaching a different history period, not teaching the Troubles and the conflict, but the majority of Catholic schools are teaching it. So there is this question around the fact that we have young people leaving the education system being taught two different versions of their own shared history. And of course, the Good Friday Agreement and the conflict itself is not mandatory within the education system. I would point out to a great campaign being done in Northern Ireland by a young person called Lauren Bond, who's doing a campaign called Teach the Troubles, which is trying to make it mandatory for young people in Northern Ireland to learn about Northern Ireland's conflict, because at the minute it isn't mandatory. And actually, I would say probably the majority of young people leave the education system with little to no real education on the Good Friday Agreement and Northern Ireland's conflict, which is crazy. How do we expect young people to take it forward if they aren't taught about it, right? Patricia, do you want to come in at this point around the politics of affecting change, given your political background?
I do. And one of the things I want to say is, and we don't often credit ourselves or acknowledge us in Northern Ireland, but we actually already have all the answers. And I want to pick up on that last point that you made about teaching the conflict. I can tell you more about how our education system enriches conflict and contributes to social segregation and all the rest than I can about how it contributes to peace building. But I have this one example that made it through with MDFM, as it was back in the good looking days, and then was dropped because there was a media pile-on about it. A very gifted and talented academic called Leslie Emerson designed a curriculum called From Prison to Peace. There was a randomized control trial conducted on it, and it evidenced attitudinal change on a scale that is not common in academia. This curriculum handheld teachers to teach the controversial issues underpinning the conflict. It was focused exclusively on de-glamorizing conflict and paramilitarization, to the extent that at the end of the curriculum, the schools that were involved brought in former combatants from loyalist and then Republican sides of the divide. And they, through their lived experience testimony, worked to de-glamorize the conflict with young people. And it was no holds barred conversation. They could ask the former combatants anything that they wanted. The attitudinal change, the evidence was there to say this will work, and it was dropped because of the political controversy and the media storm that surrounded it. Why am I saying that? I'm saying it because we can so very quickly in Northern Ireland fall into a state of what I would say is learned helplessness. A lot of this boils down to political will, but not all of it. And as Anne has already said, if we're to wait on our politicians to action the change we know needs to be actioned, we'll be waiting a long time. So I'm going to say something controversial. But before I do, let me explain. In my socio-legal mind, there's, broadly speaking, 3 levels of societal organization. You have your structural level, which is your politics, legislation, your cultural level, which is your community, your institutions, and the individual level. Okay, if we start at the individual level, I wholeheartedly believe that systemic change can be enacted by individuals on the ground if they are given access and knowledge on how to exercise their rights. I think that can be enhanced at the minute through better provision of legal aid funding. There's a number of small firms in Northern Ireland are taking judicial reviews and cases with regards to children being excluded, not having their educational entitlements made or met, and also SEM provision that's not being adequately delivered. The more we do that, the more we forcefully and fundamentally make the system change, because whenever case precedent is set, then that sets the standard for how education can operate. At the cultural level, as Matthew was talking about there, so many different organizations are doing great work. The more that there's a collective power, and Anne said this as well, sharing statistics, information, amplifying the voices of people who are in the harsher end of the education system, the more people are upskilled in our society to understand what's happening. And then at the structural level, the best thing we can do is exercise our vote responsibly. We can give evidence, we can put questions to MLAs, we can go on TV and scream until we're blue in the face, but I think it's a combination of all three levels of societal organization working together, and it starts, I believe, at the individual level with taking that action, what small action you can to be forceful, essentially.
That's really good advice, Patricia. And something
taken to court.
Yeah. Yes, that was very fun, you know. But yes, I guess that's something I think everyone on this call has done and taken individual action. And I want to come back now over to you, Matt, and ask you a little bit about the transatlantic relationship. So, if there are any, I suppose, lessons that can be gained from the US for Northern Ireland or vice versa, and whether there are any opportunities for advancing issues around education through a transatlantic lens.
Completely, absolutely, completely. In my mind, the world is wider than our own street, deeper than our history, more tangled than our own textbooks, and that too must all be taught. So one thing I think about when it goes to America, I was very lucky. I got to go to Little Rock, Arkansas, and visit Little Rock High School, which I have no doubt our American guests will know about. In 1957, 9 Black students wanted to integrate into that school. And I knew of this history. We learned about it in secondary school when we were learning about the civil rights. But one thing I didn't realize there when the park ranger was giving our tour is that, yes, it happened for 8 weeks, all the hullabaloo. That's what we learned. But what we didn't learn is the school shut down for 1.5 years afterwards, and kids didn't get to go to school for 1.5 years because of that. Why am I bringing that point up? When you go and learn more about it, families who had resources were able to upleave and go and move to Fayetteville, and Fayetteville is now the biggest, is one of the biggest cities in Arkansas, and has an awful lot of investment capital coming into it because they had a very well-educated population. The reason why I bring that up is there's a modern narrative now happening in Northern Ireland with rural schools that it's better to bus children out rather than having a school integrated. And it's almost talking about forced socialization, like it's a dirty word or what's going on. But what we know from that example within the transatlantic relationship, if a school closes, it impacts that community directly, and it has long-lasting impacts 60 years on. If you have that blipping going on, that's why I think it's very important. The other thing I think what we could learn from America is more around racial healing. In 1981, when Lagan College was formed, Northern Ireland's population was 1% from people from different ethnic or religious backgrounds. That wasn't the traditional Protestant, Catholic, Unionist, Republican, loyalist, nationalist framework we talk about. Now we're sitting at the 8%, 9%, and it's only going to grow because this economy has opened up. More people are wanting to come. And touching on Matthew and Patricia's point, we have students coming who we need more language specialists to help with that, so them children can get a good quality education because it's their right. They've chose here to make it their home. So I feel there's an awful lot around the curriculum on racial healing that America is delivering or talking about at present that we could adopt and think about. But vice versa, I think here where I think there's a model here in how we teach difficult history and also how we actually teach difference in discussion. And going back to Patricia's first point in her opening remarks, she made a very good one around about how our school system here does allows you to be different, but defend your difference and make the case for why you think X, Y, and Z politically, culture, or why it's important to you, and for others to learn on board on that. And I think those are two very good lessons we can learn pedagogically across the transatlantic relation for that. I will end my comments there. I see you looking at me, Em, and I was like, I could go
That's
on
very
for a
good.
while.
No, that's very good. Anne, do you have anything you want to add on that?
Sorry. No, this is why it's good me and Matt being together. You know, segregation is segregation, whether it's special educational needs, whether it's by religious background, community background, you know, socioeconomic background. It really is all the same. It is funny talking about the US. I taught a labor economics course in Queen's briefly, and we were teaching labor market discrimination, and I'd get the course notes given to me, and it was about America. I was like, we live in one of the few developed countries that had labor market discrimination fairly recently, but we're just going to talk about an entirely different place because it might be seen as too controversial. You know, and it's always that like fear of it. So I did it, and then I says, right, okay, and now we'll talk about Catholics and Protestants. And you could feel these 20-year-olds all going, she didn't say it. Like, who cares? You know, it's not a big deal. And Patricia spoke about saying something controversial. About this time last year, I was working on a speech on academic selection, and like I had my PhD and all done, would think my grasp of the English language is fairly good. I actually Googled controversial one day because I was like, why? Actually, this really is not controversial. We say it all the time because the minute you start to criticize somebody else here, like that's not controversial. We are allowed to have different opinions and that just happens. But it nearly feels like certain people, if I, as Anne Devlin, critique a certain policy or decision, that's controversial, but it's not. If the research is there and the context is there and you have a good grasp of it, that shouldn't be controversial. That should just be adult conversation.
Yeah, welcome to Northern Ireland, I guess, right? Where everything is controversial, but you make a very good point around the fact that that ability to have debate, to have policy criticisms, that's democracy, right?
Yeah.
It's not controversial actually at all. Thank you, Anne. That's a good point. Matthew, Patricia, you want to come in on either of these points on the US connection?
Yeah, I think I can probably speak from a lived experience perspective. I have done a couple of different transatlantic programs that have been really invaluable to me in terms of my career, education, but more importantly, my worldview. I'm a really strong believer in the value of exposure, not just in terms of enhancing diversity, but in terms of enhancing your self-worth. Whenever I did NCAFP or the Washington Ireland program, every time I go to America, the cultural differences are so stark. We're alike in so many ways, but different in so many others. Americans I really admire for their forwardness, their glass half full approach to life, and their sheer drive. You know, it comes from their individualism, I suppose, as a philosophical starting point for a country, but I find that really inspirational. It's always brought me out of my shell. But in terms of lessons learned in the transatlantic scale, I had a really interesting conversation with John Connorton, actually, whenever I was over with NCAFP, and I was talking about children's rights and amplifying the voice of the child, Article 12, the United Nations Conventions on the Right of the Child. And he actually said to me, and you would assume because of the rights challenges and the lack of adoption in the States, that the States would be quite far behind the UK. And that's not always the case. When it comes to the voice of the child or the voice of the student, the voice of the learner, America has gone there, and then it's gone a step almost too far. And what do I mean by that? If we talk about rights, I think a lot of what we're talking about right now is education rights and the right to be heard and the right to many different things. Anytime we talk about rights, we also need to talk about our responsibilities. And we're talking about peace building, we're talking about controversial issues, we're talking about what's at stake. So I always advocate for children's rights to be heard, their voices to be acted upon. But we also need to then take lessons from America where things have gone a bit too far and the balance is off kilter, and make sure that we take that learning home and enforce you have rights, but you have responsibilities in exercising and claiming your rights. And there's many lessons America could learn from us. And it's that synergy of coming together with an open mind, an open heart, and disagreeing well that will bring development if we're willing to engage in it. So that's my perspective.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And I believe John's on the call, so he'll love that. Matthew, do you want to add anything about the transatlantic relationship and how it can be beneficial?
I think one thing that has kind of mirrored between the US and the UK is the changing media landscape that obviously applies to young people through perspective of fact checking and knowing how to decipher the media. We've seen the US media is divided based on its viewpoint, left or right, conservative or liberal. Whereas we've seen that also start to happen in the UK. We have GB News, we've got Talk TV, all of these other right-wing media outlets that are really appealing to young people. You've seen like social media has completely transformed the media, and learning a lot from the US in terms of how that's used is really beneficial for the that relationship as well.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I want to bring in a question here from Mazuma, who's in the Q&A. And also just to remind people on the call that if you have a question for the participants, please do just add it into the Q&A box. We've got about 20 minutes left, so we'll try and get to your questions. So the question I have here is around the views of young people to peace processes and whether that's impacted by social media and the digital landscape. I have a feeling that the answer here is going to be yes, but if anyone would like to come in specifically on the potential impact that social media is or could have on the views of young people towards peace processes, please answer.
So I feel like I've quite a lot to say here. So you keep me on point, Emma, in terms of ranting. But yes, fundamentally, social media has a disproportionate impact on the views of not just children and young people, but adults when it comes to peace building. To put it in context, in the 70s, there was really stringent legislation enacted so that advertising companies could not fundamentally brainwash and influence children and young people. When social media was introduced, that legislation no longer applied because you couldn't legislate for the tech sphere. And we're still seeing the outer workings of that influence and manipulation. That has been evidenced through recent race riots, through the race riots of last summer, through the riots that happened on the peace line between the Falls and the Shankill at Lanark Way. That was all coordinated and organised through social media. So logistically, there's a role to play there. In terms of mis and disinformation, I'm not aware of any study that has captured the scale at which this has taken place in Northern Ireland, but I can tell you that young people are being fundamentally brainwashed through the unrelenting algorithmic system that teaches them not what is happening, what peace building is about, what's happened with the conflict, but essentially, as one child said on BBC News, we came out to riot because our community leaders were telling us to do so. We got notifications on social media. I'm not too sure what it's about, but I've been told that the people on the other side of the fence are getting more than we are, and I believe we're entitled to more. So that gives you an idea of, the extent to which there are real life implications of what is outer workings of what's happening online. But also we see through other movements this being exemplified. So the rise of misogyny in the incel community, people like Andrew Tate who are promoting hatred and the indoctrination of young males. And a lot of it, most of it is down to the negative and disproportionate influence social media has. And it is criminal, in my opinion. So that's my perspective and experience.
And Matthew, want to come in?
I think Patricia covered it really, really well there. I think the race riots and the racism is particularly interesting. Again, it's just another form of segregation. I suppose links into with sort of left behind places and stuff. And, we see that in the US as well. But no, I just think there's a really important role for education to play here for children before they're coming up into that social media world now. It just feels like there's a lot of division.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just add something, sorry. In my day-to-day work, I did a report on dis and misinformation for the Department of the Taoiseach. And one thing I found very critical that was most worrying was sort of the mistruth of something rather than disinformation directly, because you could make the case of argument, but you could easily plant in that mistruth, and that allows the seed to grow, and you're able to build a conspiracy, you're able to build ideas around this. I want to touch on what Patricia said around the peace walls, and just to build like maybe a context around this question. The people that's impacted the most in our society are the most vulnerable. In working class communities that have been completely ignored, you have motorways built around them, you have walls built around them, you have areas where they're kept and not allowed to move or have any form of social mobility. And education is the only opportunity for this, and they're told the education they're getting is fine, but it's not. As we've been having a discussion this past week in Northern Ireland, not all schools are getting the same resources to be able to provide a standard approach. And I feel those are the most impacted, and the ones that are most susceptible are the ones that have not received the dividends of peace that has been promised to us all. And as a society, we really need to lift a mirror up to ourselves and ask, what is wrong that we are leaving them behind, and carry on leaving them behind.
Thank you very much, Matt. And I've got a question in here from Kate Lynch, who's given you specifically a shout out, Matt, if you'd like to have a read of the question. And is asking a question around, as a newly qualified teacher, when talking about the role of education in this discussion, how can we help facilitate these conversations in the classroom if a school is reluctant to this work overtly being done in the school? Any advice or guidance?
I can probably come in there too, because I've faced this experience myself, and I just want to take a minute to acknowledge the complexity and the challenge that faces this situation, and it's one that needs to be navigated considerately, and with caution. Everybody's probably familiar with the term human rights defender and what that means across the globe. That applies in the classroom as well. You can be a human rights defender, and that means amplifying voices, teaching controversial issues, but to the powers that be, you're then viewed as a human rights agitator. That has real life implications for the individual in terms of their career, which then impacts upon their livelihood and their health. So I just want to caveat what I'm about to say with that acknowledgement, and reinforce that a lot of this work in that context comes down to your professional intuition and how far you can take it. My advice would be, if you can create a psychologically safe space within your classroom that will enable conversations to take place, that's a starting point. But then part of creating that psychologically safe environment is making young people aware of their rights and responsibilities outside of that classroom environment. So if you move from one classroom where you're teaching controversial issues, you have the young people, they trust you, they're debating and they're discussing with one another, and they move into another classroom, traditional pedagogy, rote learning, high disciplinary focus on classroom management, and they start even discussing that topic, that creates the bedrock for conflict to occur, which has real life consequences. So it comes down to your appetite for risk, your professional judgment on the safety balance that you have to strike here. If you open these conversations, if you create a safe environment within your classroom, could that then lead to more risk down the line as soon as they leave your four walls? If it does, you have a professional decision to make about assessing that risk. So there's no straight answer in that regard. The other thing that you can do, cautiously, carefully, considerately, is open a conversation within the hierarchy. 9 times out of 10, when we're working in schools that are unwelcome to controversial issues or opening these discussions, it's based around what Matt talked about at the start. It's a deep fear, usually grounded in lived experiences that shouldn't go unacknowledged. There's a job to be done in terms of having psychologically safe conversations within the hierarchy. I would start from the top and work my way down. I would go to the head, broach it with them, see if there's any movement or any any opportunity to have some sort of initiative within the school, and see where it goes from there. If it is shut down immediately, then you have a good idea of the risks that you're taking if you continue to push it. Another thing that you could do is partner with outside organizations who are trained and versed in this, and ask them to come to the school, make representations, explain what's involved. So again, there's an individual perspective in your classroom, there's a cultural perspective going to the head. Sorry, there's a cultural perspective partnering with organizations, and there's a structural perspective in getting buy-in from the head. My last piece of advice, again, controversial. If at the end of the day, all three of those approaches fail, you have to prioritize yourself, and there's big questions you need to ask about your continued viable future within that setting. Because culture either happens by design or default, and when it happens by default, it can be disastrous. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you very much, Patricia. That was really comprehensive response on some of the options. And I suppose one thing that I would add to that, Kate, is the group I had mentioned earlier, Parallel Histories, that's UK based. They actually work with schools in Northern Ireland and organise events in terms of debates around the history module and topics that can be quite beneficial to look at the work that they're doing and whether or not there's opportunities to have them involved at your school. Matt, Matthew, Anne, anyone want to come in on Kate's question?
Yeah, just very quickly, just to say, Kate, lovely to see you again. Well, virtually meet you again. I just want to say that NICE, the Northern Ireland Council for Integrated Education, actually has a whole module and pedagogical approach free for any school. Doesn't have to be integrated school, that you could download and maybe try and tailor make to your school. I don't want to tell you how to do your practice. I'm just trying to guide you to a resource there. That's not. The other thing I want to say, in my own experience, we did peace days when I went to an integrated school, and it was in North Belfast, Hazelwood, and it was very much along those lines. Thankfully, not anymore. A lot of work has been done there, and we would take a full day out of the year, and people were allowed to actually bring in something that meant to them. It could have been a Celtic top, it could have been a flag in relation to the UVF, anything. It didn't matter how controversial. But one thing everybody had to do was explain why it was important to them. And then people were out to stand and challenge them, like, well, it upsets me because of X, Y, and Z. And you gained a deeper understanding. But I think going back to Patricia's point, there can be always a cost of these things and how you go about doing it. So whatever you're thinking of doing, do seek help, do seek best advice. And I don't think it was controversial at the end, Patricia. You do have to look after yourself because you're in a tough profession.
Thank you very much, Matt. And I want to bring in Anne and Matthew on a final question, I suppose, from me. It strikes me that all of the policy papers and all the work that you are all doing is very much about creating a equitable and inclusive education system. So if I can come to you first, Anne, and if you could share a little bit on why an equitable and inclusive education system is so important and how it can, I suppose, create a sustainable future for Northern Ireland's peace process.
Yeah, well, going back to what we talked about, the conflict might not always be Catholic Protestant, but we can see how maybe certain areas where there was more violence, or maybe that are left behind, as Matt said, now are having these sort of issues with race riots and whatever. So that sustainability of the peace is key. I just think, like we've talked about lots of things, there's so many ways you could look at this. You can think about the child, you can, like, even from a totally stepping away, a total economist view, having all these different types of schools isn't sensible. It's not the best way to be spending money. It's not the best thing for children. We know that parents don't want to be picking between different types of school. There's just so many reasons there seems to be for why the way the education system in the North currently is set up isn't really working. And then in terms of that, I think Kate's a really prime example of the problems we're seeing here in terms of that sustainable peace. And I think I suppose if you're even thinking along these lines, you're doing something right, hopefully, and it's a movement in one direction. Something else I was just thinking about as we've been chatting is, and this will maybe be useful for Kate as well. I remember one time one of our neighbours, she was delighted her 15-year-old had come home and was going on a shared education trip with a Protestant school that was about a quarter of a mile down the road from her own school. And she came home and asked what a Protestant was. And her mummy thought this was brilliant because you know, they obviously grew up at a time where you definitely knew about these things. But I thought that's not an improvement. Not knowing about this whole other half of our society is not an improvement and is not going to lead us to that long-term sustainable peace that we need to be seeing.
That reminds me of a comment that was made by the former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, I think last year, where he said it was a good thing that Northern Ireland young people don't remember the conflict in Northern Ireland. And I would maybe counter that it's not necessarily good that young people don't know what happened during the conflict that we had
Exactly.
here. So it's a similar vein to what you're saying there, Anne.
Yeah.
Matthew, would you like to come in a little bit here about how an inclusive and equitable education system can contribute to the sustainability of Northern Ireland's peace process?
I think we were talking earlier about equity and the recent race riots. It's very clear that equity prevents resentment, and resentment is a very big topic within Northern Ireland. You know, some communities feeling as if they have more than others or more opportunities than others. And creating an equitable and inclusive system means that those arguments for things like paramilitaries and, you know, violence are heavily reduced if we create a system that is equal and has opportunities for everyone. Because you see that Protestant boys, for example, have the lowest educational attainment, and that's a very high proportion of you know, people who are going out rioting on one side of the community and the same for the other. You could argue that by offering opportunities, whether that's apprenticeships or further education, creating that sense of equity makes it far less likely that the appeal of paramilitaries is as strong as it is currently. I also think there's other ways of improving peace that we could do very easily. Digital exclusion is a big thing in terms of we have rural schools that have limited access to high quality networks and devices. I think that's you can stop integrated education, but you can't stop social media you can speak to anyone easily. So it's very easy to learn from other communities, other backgrounds online. It's not as good, obviously, as being in the classroom, but I think it certainly helps that kind of end goal that we were talking about. So I think that's important as well. And then we can learn a lot from the US in terms of how it's done things around, especially around things like gun violence and things. That is a huge issue, and we're not really treating the riots, or they're called anti-immigration protests, and the way that it's covered seems to be very one-sided, and it's not really taken as seriously as I think it should be, where these are heavily organized groups that are, you know, being violent on the streets, and they're targeting young people to bring into the organization. It's not just a protest where people show up, it's a targeted effort to discriminate against people. And I think that reflection of how that's shown and covered and reported on would make a difference as well.
Thank you, Matthew. It's an important point to bring up around the role and responsibility of the media in terms of how it covers these kinds of instances. And the point you make around the fact that young people are being taken advantage of by these organized groups and by paramilitaries. We also know that it's predominantly or often young people who are coming from socially or economically deprived backgrounds as well. So it is a serious issue that often is not covered or addressed in the way that it should be. And as we're coming to a close, I want to quickly give both Patricia and Matt a quick closing comment. So Patricia, would you like to come in on this final question we had around the sustainability of Northern Ireland's peace process and education? And then I'll pass it over to Matt.
Yeah, I suppose in summing up, I think, again, I'm going to reiterate my first point. I think we have a lot of the answers. I think we get fixated on the lack of political will, and we overlook the level of goodwill and active will that there is for collective action in the community amongst ourselves and what can be changed. And I would just reiterate and encourage people to focus on that, focus on small actions that you can take on a daily basis that build, take legs, and have a lasting impact beyond what you're often able to see. I'm entirely optimistic. I'm hopeful for Northern Ireland. At times I haven't been, but I am now and will continue to be. And a very last comment, randomly to throw in at the end, a massive comment, is a lot of this is going to be taken out of our hands in the very near future with the emergence and the rapid uptake of AI and technology. Opens a whole other conversation, whole other webinar, but change will happen whether we like it or not. So stay optimistic, take action, and come together.
Thank you, Patricia. An optimistic note. Matthew, can you match it with optimism? I mean, Matt?
I am Matthew, I am Matt, I'm whatever it can be, what you want me to be. For me, thinking of all this, the central challenge in Northern Ireland today is not that integration is impossible. It is integration threatens the status quo, and that's what we're challenging. And those who benefit from the status quo are never really that quick to dismantle it. And we see this in continued resistance to integrated education and our peace process, in ministers who ignore the will of parents, in parties that defend division under the banner of identity, and in bureaucracies that ask for transformation to justify itself while letting segregation go unquestioned, going back to Matthew's point, which I think is a very important one that we take away. But in my mind, there's also deeper, quieter challenges building on what Matthew and Anne's talking about around poverty, trauma, and distrust that shape how communities respond to educational challenges, particularly in communities still scarred by conflict, where trauma runs in families like surnames. Integration can feel like erasure. People will protest why they know, even when they know it is still hurting them. But for me, solutions are there. If we choose to see them, we must simply be the transformation process and remove financial disincentives that trap schools in old categories and ensure that integrated education is not seen as a threat to cultural identity, but as a stage where all identities can really stand up with dignity. I think, going back to Anne's point, I think it will become an economic necessity at one point that we will have to do it, and it'll be on the table. I wish it was some for more lofty ideas, but I think it will very much will come that we'll get more integrated schools. One final point, to be controversial towards Patricia, I'm not convinced in the AI revolution, as maybe you are, to take this all out of our hands. I think it's going to add more problems, more issues, and more equitable problems around a dividing class system. But that's all. But maybe we could get another debate going, and we'll
Looks like we're going to have to get another debate going here. AI debate's going to come up next. But that's fantastic, Matt. Thank you very much. These have all been fantastic. I hope that everyone that joined this call feels as inspired as I do at the end of it. There's, of course, challenges, but there are lots of solutions, as you have rightly said, and we all have a role to play in the small actions and acts that we can do to try and improve things. So thank you all very much for joining the call. Thank you for those who have attended. Thank you to my colleagues Susan and Shayna for helping to put this together. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you all a lovely rest of your afternoon or evening, wherever you are.